Hello, welcome to this three-part program on 19th century American art. My name is Jan Herndon, and I'm a volunteer docent at the Polk Museum of Art. Over the next three classes, we'll take a look at some of the artists, works, and movements of the 19th century, an era that truly shaped and defined the visual arts in this country. So let's first take a look at some of the major events of the early decades of the 19th century, events that will directly affect and be reflected in the arts. Post-Revolution America. At the beginning of the century, the newly independent United States is going through a lot of things that are new. A new capital being built on the Potomac, new innovations with the Industrial Revolution in full swing, new territories of expansion, new forms of transportation like the railroad. America soon comes to be regarded as the new promised land and takes on an idyllic, mythical status that would last until the Civil War and the Lincoln assassination further into the century. Any promising artist who can afford it will still train in Europe. Europe will remain the center of the art world for another 100 years or so, but Americans now have the option of training on this side of the Atlantic as well. The Louisiana Purchase at the beginning of the century, along with the purchase of Alaska, buying this parcel from Napoleon could be classified as one of the best deals ever. At a price of $15 million, that breaks down to under 3 cents an acre. American territory doubles in one fell swoop, and this kicks off our storied western expansion. Artists will take part by chronicling the move west, the Native Americans they encounter, wildlife, and the iconic image of the American cowboy. The landscape genre, especially American landscapes, will gain a new respect worldwide. The Louisiana Purchase will eventually result in the displacement of tens of thousands of Native Americans. We'll look at this in the arts in this first session as well. And the invention of photography. The camera will become first a tool for the painter and then a tool to document current events. Later in the century, photography will become an art form in itself. Our first artist in this session, is George Catlin. Catlin originally became a lawyer, and then he became a portraitist of wealthy Philadelphians. He had no formal art training. He was entirely self-taught. In the 1830s, he made 5 trips to the West. Those trips resulted in more than 450 oil portraits and scenes like this one. His work toured America and Europe and captivated its viewers, especially the Europeans. Catlin's paintings are known for their attention to detail and the way he presents a study of how these people actually lived, their dress, their customs, how they hunted and trapped. They capture the ambivalence of the relationship between the Native Americans and the Western settlers, which is going to be coming to a head in the following decades. Catlin's portrait here of the white cloud was exhibited in the Paris Salon of 1846. I can just imagine how that fit in there. The bourgeois Parisians were stunned by the spectacle and strangeness of the vast American wilderness, and it's what they referred to, its noble savages. Catlin eventually met the chief, pictured here, in Victorian London, when the chief and his family were touring Europe as part of P.T. Barnum's traveling circus. The dancing Indians were a featured act in Barnum's Greatest Show on Earth, which showcased what Barnum believed to be rare cultural curiosities from all over the world. He said at that time, "I love the Indians for their dignity, which is natural and noble. Vanity is the same all the world over. Rings in the nose or rings in the ears, they are all the same." However, Catlin's portrayal here of the white cloud, regal and majestic and noble, was in sharp contrast to the squalid way in which Barnum treated him. Indian performers during the 19th century, whether they were with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show or Barnum's circus, were by and large cruelly exploited. Barnum wrote of the challenges of including Indians in his act while denigrating them, quote, "They are a lazy, shiftless set of brutes, though they will draw in a crowd," unquote. In 1830, the U.S. Senate passed the Indian Removal Bill, calling for the official removal of Indians living east of the Mississippi. This resulted in forced transplantation of scores of Native Americans such as the infamous Trail of Tears, where tens of thousands of Native Americans died. These portraits portray several Plains Indian chiefs here on the left who traveled to Washington in the 1830s to meet with President Monroe and to negotiate Native American territorial rights with the government. Charles Bird King, the artist, painted them in his Washington studio and later showed the portraits in Europe. Notice how the chief in the foreground here, Chief War Eagle, wears a Presidential Peace Medal around his neck. This was valued by Native Americans as a sign of status and worn on all formal occasions. King painted the chiefs with a war axe, blood-red face paint, and eagle feathers atop their heads, reinforcing the romantic image of Indians. The portrait on the right of the maiden Eagle of Delight shows her royal lineage by the blue forehead dot. That was a symbol of royalty. In 1822, she came with her husband and an Indian delegation of chiefs to Washington. She was described as beautiful and charmed many that they met with. Sadly, this maiden died of measles shortly after their visit. It's likely she contracted the disease during her travels. Sympathizers to the plight of the Native American, like Catlin and King, bought into the myth of a, quote, vanishing people, genetically inferior and destined to die out to a superior European race. They pointed to the Indians succumbing to alcoholism, the epidemics of measles and smallpox that wiped out great numbers of them. Catlin wrote in his memoirs, "They are doomed and must perish." He sees his art, and King as well, as a way to memorialize them after they disappear. What Catlin, King, and others painted and recorded at this time is virtually all we know of some of these cultures. Art truly does go political here. In this example, the Native American has gone from noble savage to demonic attacker. This bas-relief carving on the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol building was carved by an Italian, Enrico Calcici. It shows Daniel Boone locked in mortal combat with an enormous Indian, while a smaller one lies dead on the ground between them. The scene illustrates an episode in 1773 when Boone led a party of settlers across the Kentucky frontier. They were attacked by Indians, but Boone's bravery encouraged the settlers to drive them off. Notice the not-so-subtle shift in sentiment from Catlin and King and their majestic portraits to this type of depiction. The Indian warrior here is depicted as an ogre, savagery incarnate, with bulging eyes and blood-curdling snarls on their faces. Boone, meanwhile, is depicted as cool and calm. You think we're suddenly shifted to ancient Greek art and we're looking at the Parthenon? Actually, this is from the U.S. Capitol building as well. It's a bas-relief pediment carved by Thomas Crawford. Crawford spent some time studying in Europe, and so he was no doubt familiar with classical design and was able to apply that to the overall neoclassic motif of the new Capitol. This pediment was indeed modeled after Phidias's sculptures for the Parthenon. At the center is an allegorical figure for America. To her right are various figures representing security, progress, prosperity. We see a vigilant soldier, a merchant, a school teacher, 2 eager students, and a mechanic or artisan, all agents of civilization. On the other side of this pediment, on our right, we see an earlier stage of American development, a pioneer felling a tree and taming the wilderness. The marble trunk is about to fall on some Indians, a metaphor for what's actually happening. Then we see a young Indian boy, a hunter, gazing with alarm at the pioneer. On the far right end, a father, chief with headdress, gazing with alarm at the pioneer. On the far right, we see beyond this his wife and child lying in an open grave. This is the official fate of the American Indian in the 1850s. On the left here is a famous Roman reproduction of an ancient Greek sculpture called the Dying Gaul. Crawford studied in Rome where this sculpture is located, so he would have been familiar with it. Ancient Gauls were conquered by the Roman Empire, Native Americans displaced by the encroaching settlers. The similarity was certainly intentional. Everyone recognizes Audubon's work. John James Audubon, born in France, He devoted most of his career to documenting bird species in the Americas, especially the new lands acquired in the Louisiana Purchase. We could do a whole series of classes just on his large body of work, but as a Floridian, I chose his flamingo. In 1832, he wrote while sailing around the Florida peninsula, "I, for the first time, saw a flock of flamingos. Far away to seaward we spied a flock of flamingos, with well-spread wings, outstretched necks, and long legs directed backwards. Oh, reader, could you but know the emotions that then agitated my breast! I thought I had now reached the height of all my expectations, for my voyage to the Floridas was undertaken in a great measure for the purpose of studying these lovely birds in their own beautiful islands." Let's take a quick look at some of the statistics of Audubon's work. 435 hand-colored life-size prints. 25 new species were discovered by Audubon, including 6 which are now extinct. The originals were mainly done in watercolor and pastel crayons, and then prints were made from engraved plates, and these were large in size, 39 by 26 inches. His work was sold on a subscription basis, these Birds of America, each subscriber receiving 5 prints at a time for a total investment of a whopping $1,000, a huge amount in that day. His subscribers included French King Charles X, Henry Clay, and Daniel Webster. 120 complete sets remain in existence today. The last ones that sold at auction were sold at a price of nearly $12 million per set. History painting had been much more popular in the prior century. Landscapes and portraits were becoming more the American preference. Nevertheless, Washington crossing the Delaware, seen here, is one of the most recognizable images in the history of American art. Surprisingly, it was not painted by an American artist at work in the United States, but was instead completed by a German artist, Emanuel Lütze, and was painted in Dusseldorf during the middle of the 19th century. We see 3 men row at the bow. One is an African American, another wears the checkerboard bonnet of a Scotsman, the third wears a coonskin cap. In the stern are 2 farmers distinguished by their broad-brimmed hats and a man in the moccasins, pants, and hat of a Native American. This collection of people suggests the all-inclusive nature of the colonial cause during the American Revolutionary War. Despite Lütze's interest in history, there is little accuracy here with these points. Number 1, the stars and stripes shown in the painting was not actually in use until after this event. Number 2, the size of the boat is far too small to accommodate the 12 men who occupy it. Third, this crossing actually took place in the middle of the night. 4, rather than showing the Delaware River, Lütze shows what most people believe to be the Rhine, and this makes sense since this was painted in Dusseldorf, Germany. And finally, Lütze paints Washington upright. This was an unlikely and precarious posture for anyone in a short-walled rowboat like this. But his main goal was to create a work of art that deliberately glorified General Washington and the colonial American cause and commemorated a military action of particular significance. So all accuracy aside, he certainly succeeded at. Another facet of historical painting is shown here. We're moving on from the Revolution to the new conquest of settling the West. This is by George Caleb Bingham, known for his uniquely American themes. By the 1850s, the chief metaphor of the Western movement was biblical, not classical. The narrative of the Exodus is retold, only this time Daniel Boone becomes Moses, leading his people to the Promised Land. Notice how Bingham's Boone is clean-shaven, he's rather elegantly dressed. He marches toward us in the center with his rifle, radiating strength and determination. Behind Boone is a settler's wife on a white horse, suggesting another sort of an exodus, that of the Virgin Mary and the Christ child when they escaped into Egypt under the protection of Joseph. The stricken trees on either side of the canvas recall the dangers of nature, but Boone will shepherd his people through safely. So Daniel Boone as a Moses was to become a popular theme in art in the mid-19th century. Again by Bingham, this work, The Jolly Flat Boatman, is considered one of the greatest American genre paintings ever made. Genre meaning it depicts a scene from everyday life. These are not heroic or political figures. It captures the allure of Western expansion during the mid-19th century. Bingham was raised in Missouri, and he began his career as a portrait painter. He was self-taught. In 1845, he began painting his most notable works, genre scenes featuring a wide range of colorful characters that lived and worked on the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. These became the most important portrayals of life at the gateway to the western frontier. Here, Bingham has placed his central dancing figure at the apex of a triangular composition. On either side of the dancer, we have a fiddler playing a tune, another boatman keeping time on a frying pan. The rest of the men lounge on the deck as the boat floats downriver. In the foreground, Bingham includes several remarkable still life elements. We see a shirt drying in the sun, and next to it, a coonskin, and then on the right side of the boat, a coiled rope. The viewer is on the boat with these men, adding to the appeal of the composition. We're headed downriver. When this painting is completed, flatboats are quickly being replaced by steam-powered vessels that could haul freight at significantly faster speeds. So doesn't this painting remind you of Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer? It's no wonder, then, that Bingham was Mark Twain's favorite artist. Another beautiful work by Bingham, again on the river. Here we see a pair of trappers set within the beautiful luminous light of the water's tranquil surface and a soft-lit sky. I just want to point out a couple details. The man on the right is wearing a liberty cap. These were originally worn by freed Roman slaves and then worn by revolutionaries during the French Revolution and eventually by Americans in the 18th and 19th centuries. Perhaps it's included here as a symbol of the freedom found with Western expansion. And the figure on the left is actually a bear cub. So here we have a wild animal, symbol of the frontier, set alongside men who are diminishing that population of wildlife by what they do. Perhaps Bingham is foreshadowing the effects of settlement in wild America down the road. Let's move back east for a moment. The Hudson River School is not actually a school, but a group of 19th century American artists who worked in the Catskills in the Hudson River Valley. These painters specialized in romantic landscape painting, a genre that became extremely popular among wealthy Americans. Many of these artists became rich themselves and built lavish mansions on the banks of the Hudson. Thomas Cole is considered the founder of the movement. His family migrated from England when he was 17. He studied art formally for a couple years and then left school because he believed nature would be a better teacher. He earned his living first as a portraitist, theater, scene painter, and an engraver, but landscapes became his specialty. He spent his time walking in the mountains, sketching and working studies into paintings. He traveled extensively in Europe, inspired by Turner's word landscapes, and he was also inspired by the Romantic poets Byron, Wordsworth, Shelley, and Keats. His Arch of Nero seen here was created from studies he made in Italy. Notice the scale of the people to nature, the figures at the bottom. So what's the Hudson River School? It's a realistic, detailed, and sometimes idealized portrayal of nature, romanticized virgin wilderness which was fast disappearing from the Hudson Valley in upstate New York. Individual variations are going to occur. Some of these painters are going to go for a romantically composed picture, while others are going to be scientifically accurate in their detail. At least two generations of Hudson River painters created art through the century, starting at about 1825, going into the 1870s. And it's considered the first uniquely American art movement. This painting by Thomas Cole was originally titled View from Mount Holyoke, Massachusetts, after a thunderstorm. At the time, American artists were criticized in Europe for their inattentiveness to their scenery. Cole responded with this landscape that praises the uniqueness of America by encompassing what he called, quote, a union of the picturesque, the sublime, and the magnificent, unquote. It's magnificent in scale. The landscape painting considered a very low genre, especially in Europe at this time, certainly not worthy of large canvases such as this. As you can see, this is over 6 feet wide. On the left, we see a wild, storm-ravaged wilderness with broken trees, frantic birds. This is the sublime, the nature that is wild and untamed. It's in stark contrast to the built-up environment of old Europe. The promise of something new is here. America, again, is seen as the new Eden, or that promised land metaphor. On the right, we see America settling the virgin wilderness with rows of crops, livestock, homes, sunlight and promise, as if ordained by God. On that far hillside, just right of center, we can see the Hebrew letters for Shaddai. So the whole idea of manifest destiny is portrayed here by Cole. So going from left to right, we see Cole showing us the transition from sublime to pastoral. Finally, we see Cole's depiction of himself here at the bottom, in the middle distance, perched on a promontory, painting the oxbow. He's an American, producing American art in communion with American scenery, in tiny scale to the magnificence of creation. Many other artists are going to copy or imitate this painting, and it becomes the new prototype for the Hudson River School movement. Cole's landscapes are patently American. This satisfies his patrons' demands for patriotic subject matter, but he also manages to suffuse his landscapes with a sort of romantic feeling unlike anything that had appeared in American art to this point. It's both subtly nostalgic and potentially violent, tiny clues to the encroaching civilization on the untouched and disappearing wilderness. Here we are, River in the Catskills. This was only painted 6 years later, and it confirms his forebodings. Cole includes a recently built rail line that we can see going across the middle of the green ground here, and a prominent tree stump in the foreground, a symbol of industry, settlement, and material progress. Cole wrote, quote, "In civilized Europe, the primitive features of scenery have long since been destroyed or modified. The extensive forests that once overshadowed a large part of it have been felled. Rugged mountains have been smoothed, and impetuous rivers turned from their courses to accommodate the taste and necessities of a dense population. These differences are quite visible when comparing the works of Cole and other Hudson River artists to those of their European contemporaries, such as John Constable." Our next artist is Asher Durand. He was a good friend of Thomas Cole and is considered by many to be the co-founder of the Hudson River School. This beautiful painting on the right shows his good friend Thomas Cole with the Romantic poet William Cullen Bryant. This was painted as a tribute to Cole upon Cole's death in 1848 and was presented as a gift to Bryant. The painting was sold at auction at Sotheby's in 2005 for $35 million. That set the record for an American painting at the time. Durand is remembered particularly for his detailed portraits of trees, rocks, and foliage. He was an advocate for drawing directly from nature with as much realism as possible. Like other Hudson River School artists, Durand also believed that nature was an ineffable manifestation of God. In his Letters on Landscape Painting, he writes, "The true province of landscape art is the representation of the work of God in the visible creation." Durand is the most scientific of the Hudson River painters. There's nothing generic or random in his paintings. He insists on the specificity of plants, mosses, lichen, and rock formations. He studied his scenes as a botanist and geologist. He loved doing these studies of nature as a way of studying the source of life in nature, the formation of the soil and the rocks, the underlife of boulders and tree trunks. His work is like taking a magnifying glass up close to the details. He believed that this undergrowth, the underlife on the forest floor, was the literal and figurative foundation for life on the earth. Thomas Doughty, our next Hudson River School painter, was the first American painter able to devote himself entirely to landscapes, not portraits or historical paintings, and he made a living at it. Doughty was known for his languidly poetic compositions of American scenery along the eastern seaboard, images that he carefully structured to guide the viewer's eye inward from left and right through various landscape elements successively overlapping within the composition. We certainly see that in this work, View Toward the Hudson River on the left. This strategy allowed Doughty to render the natural world, much of it still a threatening wilderness in America, as appealingly rational and controlled. His view toward the Hudson presents scenery that artists of the subsequent Hudson River Valley School were already beginning to portray as sublimely grand. His manner remains distinctively more contained, focusing not on the great river, but on a modest tributary, further domesticated by three diminutive figures that you can see in the middle ground, and on the distant Hudson itself, a handful of placid sailboats just barely visible toward the middle of the painting. Again, we're seeing the minuscule significance of man against the colossal magnificence of the natural world. Jasper Cropsey was initially trained as an architect, and he took on numerous projects in New York City, but then he developed a keen interest in landscapes, and he never went back to architecture. In 1847, he traveled to Europe and settled in Thomas Cole's old studio in Rome. He spent several years in Italy and England, painting images based on studies of nature as well as idealized views of the old world. Back in New York, he devoted himself to the landscape work that would eventually bring him prominence as a second-generation Hudson River School painter. His landscapes reflect his interest in the influence of nature on man's existence, a concept that was fundamental to the Hudson River School artist. He was a founding member of the American Watercolor Society in 1867, so he worked in several media. In this painting, the windswept trees and the dark tones of brown and orange evoke the aftermath of a passing storm. The emotional and romantic quality of these paintings is typical of this movement. Cropsey really shone in his tribute to the distinctive color and romantic grandeur of the American autumn when he exhibited this work at the National Academy of Design's annual exhibition in 1876. He priced it at $2,500, the highest amount that was ever listed there at the time. This is also because of new synthetic pigments that were introduced during the later 1850s and 60s. It made this type of coloration possible. These pigments would be expanded on later in the Impressionist movement. One of the most accomplished American artists of the 19th century who enjoyed a long and successful career in both oils and watercolors was William Trost Richards. He rejected the romanticized and stylized approach of other Hudson River painters and instead insisted on very meticulous factual renderings, just the same way that Durand had done. But I want to touch here on luminism. That's sort of an offshoot of this school. It's an American landscape painting style of the 1850s and 70s, characterized by the effects of light in landscapes through using aerial perspective or the effect of light on the landscape and concealing visible brush strokes. Luminous landscapes emphasize tranquility, smooth surfaces, and often depict a calm, reflective water and a soft, hazy sky. This is something Richards was so good at. His views of the White Mountains shown in this work are almost photographic in their realism. He saw the dramatic, rugged landscapes as part of the national identity, and he used his hyper-realistic, almost photographic style to describe in detail the vastness of the scenery. He painted landscapes all his life, including along the Hudson River Valley and in Europe. He came to know other Hudson River painters like Cropsey and Church that we'll talk about soon. But it was on summer trips to the coast of New England and New Jersey, however, that Richards became absolutely infatuated with the sea. In both oil and watercolor, he was able to capture the fluidity and gentle motion of the water, as well as the delicate atmosphere of the seaside. In later years, Richards painted marine watercolors almost exclusively. Frederick Church is a figure we'll talk about next week as well. His influence on American art stretched over a large part of the century. He was the product of the second generation of the Hudson River School and a pupil of Thomas Cole. Like others in the Hudson River School, his style attempted to capture the wild realism of an unsettled America that was quickly disappearing, with feelings of discovery and appreciation for natural beauty. He's known for his extraordinary detail, romanticism, and luminism in his paintings. And he's considered one of America's greatest romantic landscape painters. Church literally crisscrossed the Western Hemisphere. Look at this gorgeous depiction of an iceberg, Beyond the American borders, he went everywhere, north and south. He painted tropical sunsets, waterfalls, icebergs, volcanoes, you name it. He painted it. He was absolutely enthralled with the diversity of the landscape in this hemisphere. We talked earlier about luminism in art. Luminous pictures are nearly always landscapes or waterscapes, but they also tend to contain large areas of sky, water, and land, and are organized geometrically. So, for instance, specific objects might be carefully aligned with the edges of the canvas. Like French Impressionism that would come later, luminism is all about the depiction of light, but its treatment is very different. While an Impressionist landscape may be said to surround and engulf the viewer with its depiction of sunlight, a luminist landscape typically contains a much deeper perspective, along with objects captured in detail in crystal clear light, like a frozen moment when time stops. The effect of this is often a sense of great tranquility and calm, further enhanced by the luminous technique of concealing all visible brushwork beneath a smooth, slick finish. This is in direct contrast with the Impressionists, who celebrated these rough, quick brush strokes and seeing all the texture. Church was an ambitious painter and an enthusiastic amateur scientist. Geology was a new science in the 19th century, and Church was among those who believed that volcanoes offered clues to the age and origins of the earth. He studied what was written at the time about Ecuador's Mount Cotopaxi, quote, the most dreadful volcano, its explosions most frequent and disastrous. This mountain provided both a poetic symbol of God's creation and an exciting window into the planet's natural history for Church. This is a painting I would love to see. Church's Niagara Falls attempts to capture what many believe to be a natural setting superior to anything in Europe. Look at the scale of this work. The width is twice its height, like a giant panorama. The dimensions of the falls itself give the onlooker a unique view. Church drops the nearest side of the falls down to allow the viewer a clear view of the waterfall on the other side. He's the first painter to render the falls in such detail, naturalism, and on such a grand scale. Although this is the Canadian side of the falls, they represented to many at the time the strength and power of the New World. Colossal landscapes are simply that sort of patriotic power. Church was also a savvy marketer. He knew this was something special and exhibited this one painting show in New York City. The first 2 weeks there, more than 100,000 visitors paid 25 cents apiece to see what had become, quote, an American image. So you can do the math and see what kind of a fortune that racked up for him. The work then toured Paris and London, also reproduced into chromolithographs. This one painting made him quite wealthy and created a demand for his work. And this gentleman's work is my favorite of the group. Albert Bierstadt was brought to America as an infant by his German parents. He later studied in Dusseldorf after spending a year in Italy. In 1859, at the age of 29, he made his first trip west as far as the Rocky Mountains. Bierstadt was totally smitten with the rugged, majestic landscape, and he would dedicate the rest of his life to painting the American West, like this beautiful view of Yosemite. This is Bierstadt's most famous painting. Look at the dimensions of it, 6 by 10 feet. He's following Church's example of creating an overscaled canvas to convey the immensity of nature. He's truly the first painter to bring Americans a visualization of grandeur and romance of the West, and what he called, quote, the aboriginals. Here we can see in their teepees and the Indian encampments in the foreground. This painting is the major work that resulted from the artist's first trip to the West, one of a number of large works painted after his return from these travels. In 1863, it was exhibited to great acclaim and purchased 2 years later for the then astounding sum of $25,000 by an American living in London. This is not an authentic scene, but rather a composite work. In other words, Bierstadt took elements from various sketches and studies and created his scenes on canvas back in his studio. An anonymous critic at the time said, speaking of the Indians in the foreground, their customs and habits through it will be preserved when perhaps the scene which it depicts will no longer echo to the ring of their war cry or mark their stealthy step following in the chase. Upon that very plain where now an Indian village stands, a city populated by our descendants may rise, and in its art galleries this picture may eventually find a resting place." Unquote. How prophetically true was that? Bierstadt was also a skilled photographer. He used his photographs in his studio to refer to and to enhance the detail in his painting. So you can see from the date here, 1859, that we're just prior to the Civil War. That's where photography will really come into play, and we'll talk about that next time. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad is completed. Bierstadt is hired soon thereafter by one of the railroad barons to paint this scene in an attempt to make the statement that the beauty of the Sierras has not been compromised by the arrival of the railroad. He doesn't show trains or track per se, but he does show the snow sheds. These are snow supporting structures for avalanche control or to maintain passage in an area where the snow removal becomes impossible. This particular pass was known to have 60 to 70 feet of snow in the winter with 12-foot drifts. Paintings like this became a great promotional tool for the Transcontinental Railroad. Bierstadt made his sketches and completed it back in his San Francisco studio, and it was put on public display by the railroad to great acclaim. This helped to drive not only Eastern Americans but also Europeans to cross the Atlantic to come west on the railroad. Here's another beautiful work by Bierstadt. Note the enormous scale of painting dramatized by the herd of deer in the foreground. Bierstadt maintains the luminous quality of those Hudson River School luminists, although he's far beyond the Hudson River at this point. Critics have noted that these mountains look more like the Alps than the Sierra Nevadas. He may have taken some artistic license, especially since he spent considerable time in Europe. Again, his paintings are composites of various elements that he observed. They're not always accurate scene by scene. He became very successful in his lifetime. Like others, Bierstadt built a mansion on the Hudson River. He made numerous trips west as far as Alaska. He was also very popular in Europe. He even had an audience with Queen Victoria, whom he described as very charming and a very agreeable lady. We can't talk about Western art without mentioning Frederick Remington. Remington grew up in New York State, studied briefly at Yale, but in 1881 he left New York and traveled west in search of his own fortune. He tried cattle ranching, sheep ranching, mining. He ran a hardware business. He owned a saloon. He was all over the place, working in places from Kansas to Montana. Then Remington began to write, and he provided sketches and illustrations for various journals that were published back east. The American public fell in love with the view of the Wild West that Remington presented. They couldn't get enough. This appetite for Western subject matter can be gauged by the eagerness of the editors of New York's Harper's Weekly, the largest circulation journal in the country at the time. They put Remington on contract for a princely annual stipend of $8,000. That was a huge salary at the time. His images would become the inspiration for the fledgling film industry and that American genre of the Hollywood Western. With Remington, we no longer see that smooth, luminous style where we don't see brush strokes. Now we're seeing brush strokes and texture. His style continues to evolve, but it's definitely unphotographic. Remington marks a return to genre art like we've seen on the Mississippi with Bingham. The human figure is again emerging as a subject matter. Now it's the cowboy and the Native American's turn to be depicted. Remington was capable of working in a variety of styles and media. This sample assortment doesn't even include his sculpture. He could be called a Renaissance man, a virtuoso of several media. He was also an avid collector of memorabilia, like uniform insignia, Native American artifacts, tack, equipment, other items that he would find in his travels. This lent authenticity and detail to his work. Between 1885 and 1888, Remington made a number of trips to the American Southwest, principally to cover the U.S. cavalry and its pursuit of the Apaches. He filled his diaries with observations, made countless field sketches, he took many photographs with the latest equipment, and he collected numerous artifacts to use in his paintings. While there, he also became acquainted with some of the military officers who assisted him in his collecting efforts after he returned to the East. This painting, A Dash for the Timber, launched his career as a major painter when it was exhibited to critical acclaim at the National Academy in 1889. Indeed, Remington's skillful delineation of the horses is a particular artistic triumph. They charge toward us with nostrils flaring, every muscle straining to its limits. The headlong motion of horses and riders seems suspended above patches of cool purple and shadowy blue. This contrasts beautifully with the warmer hues of yellow and orange in the surrounding landscape. The overall effect of the painting is truly cinematic. It's over 7 feet long. The action-filled portrayal of the struggle of life on a dangerous frontier anticipates the many Western films that were to follow after the turn of the century. Indeed, you can almost just imagine this is the opening scene of a John Wayne movie. Thanks to chromophotography, Remington was one of the first American artists to illustrate the true gait of the horse in motion. Previously, horses in full gallop were usually depicted with all 4 legs pointing out, like hobby horses. The galloping horse became Remington's signature subject. Copied and interpreted by many Western artists who followed him, they adopted the correct anatomical motion this way. Although he was criticized by some for his use of photography, Remington often created depictions that slightly exaggerated natural motion to satisfy the eye. The episode of the buffalo gun, shown here at the bottom, was painted by Remington in the last year of his life. Notice the loose brush strokes and the heavy impasto texture. There are shades of Impressionism. This is just in the turn of the century, which was very much the style at the time. And again, it shows his versatility. And finally, Remington's bronzes. He began working in sculpture after he had already established his career as a painter and illustrator. This one, the Bronco Buster, was the first he created and remains the most popular of all of Remington's sculptures. The original was cast in 1895, a sand casting, and it stands at 22 inches tall. There was a later version cast in 1909 with the lost wax process. It stands 10 inches taller at 32 inches. An original cast also resides in the Oval Office, so that might be why this one's particularly familiar to us. Remington is best known for his bronze sculptures. He seemed to realize that this was the part of his artistic output that would be his most enduring legacy. He even predicted it, saying in 1895, "My oils will all get old and watery, my watercolors will fade, but I am to endure in bronze. I am modeling. I find I do well. I am a cowboy on a bucking bronco, and I am going to rattle down through the ages." The reproductions of his bronzes continue to be made today. There are no originals available for anything less than $75,000, and they're usually auctioned through Christie's or Sotheby's. So we've more or less covered the first half of the 19th century. Join us next time as we talk about the ominous clouds on the horizon. Literally, some American painters reflect the approaching divide in the country in their landscapes. The role of art and photography for the first time in a major way in depicting the military conflict and the abolitionist cause, and the efforts to heal and reunite the country after the war. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.